"Either you step up like a real partner or pack your bags," she said, standing in my loft apartment like she owned the place. Rachel had been living here rent-free for 10 months while I paid for everything, but somehow I was the one who needed to prove myself. This ultimatum came after her sister Vanessa moved back to town with her ballroom dancing obsession and 3 kids who had already cost me $1,200 in damaged audio equipment. I'm a sound engineer, 31 years old, and I work 55-hour weeks in a job that requires precision and attention to detail. My loft apartment doubles as my home studio, filled with carefully calibrated equipment that represents years of saving and investment in my career. My expensive monitors, mixing board, and acoustic panels aren't toys, but Vanessa's children treated them like a playground during their last visit, leaving me with repair bills that took weeks to sort out. The damage wasn't just cosmetic. Professional audio equipment requires precise calibration, and any impact or moisture can affect performance in ways that aren't immediately obvious but become critical during recording sessions. Rachel watched it happen and said kids will be kids, like destroying someone's professional equipment was just part of growing up. Now Vanessa was back with her dance partner, chasing some competitive ballroom dream that required weekend competitions across the state, and apparently I was the designated free childcare. Rachel explained this like it was obvious, like family obligations I never agreed to were suddenly my responsibility because I happened to be dating her sister. She'd been building up to this conversation for days, dropping hints about how important family was and how real men stepped up when needed. I'd seen the writing on the wall when she started comparing me unfavorably to her friends' boyfriends who helped with various family duties, always with that tone that suggested I was somehow lacking as a partner. The weekend schedule she laid out was insane: Friday evenings, all-day Saturday, and Sunday mornings, watching 3 kids aged 5, 7, and 9 while Vanessa and her dance partner traveled to competitions. These weren't well-behaved children either. They were the kind who climbed on furniture, touched everything they weren't supposed to, and needed constant supervision to prevent them from destroying whatever was within reach. During their previous visit, I'd watched in horror as the youngest had somehow managed to spill an entire juice box into my vintage Neve mixing console, requiring expensive cleaning and recalibration that my insurance didn't cover because it was considered accidental damage. The 7-year-old had used my studio monitors as climbing apparatus, leaving scuff marks and loosening the mounting brackets, while the 9-year-old had pulled cables out of my patch bay like they were jump ropes, creating a tangle that took me 3 hours to sort out and test for damage. Rachel seemed to think this was perfectly reasonable, that my weekends recovering from demanding work weeks should be sacrificed so her sister could pursue her dancing hobby. When I pointed out that I'd already paid for the damage from their last visit and wasn't eager to risk my equipment again, she called me selfish and said I clearly didn't understand what being in a relationship meant. The conversation escalated when I mentioned that Vanessa could find actual childcare or skip some competitions, suggestions that Rachel dismissed as unrealistic because dance partners were hard to find and this was Vanessa's chance to make something of herself. She'd been working herself up to this ultimatum for weeks, I realized, testing my responses and building her case for why I should comply. Her freelance graphic design work gave her flexible hours and plenty of free time, but somehow she couldn't watch the kids herself because she needed to support Vanessa emotionally at the competitions. The logic made no sense, but Rachel had this way of presenting unreasonable demands like they were perfectly normal, like anyone who objected was being difficult for no good reason. Standing there in my own apartment, listening to her explain why my weekends belonged to her sister's children, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about helping family or being supportive. This was about Rachel testing how much she could push me before I pushed back, and she'd finally found my limit. I'd been generous with Rachel from the start, covering her share of groceries, utilities, and dinners out because her freelance income was unpredictable. I'd adjusted my schedule to accommodate her needs, rearranged my studio time to spend evenings with her, and even tolerated her habit of leaving her design projects scattered across my dining table where I usually reviewed client contracts. But this ultimatum about sacrificing my weekends to enable her sister's hobby felt like the final test in a series of escalating demands, each one designed to see how much of my life I'd surrender to keep the peace. Rachel stood there with her arms crossed, clearly expecting me to cave like I had with smaller requests before, but something about her casual assumption that I'd comply made my decision crystal clear. She'd calculated wrong this time, mistaking my previous compromises for unlimited compliance, not realizing that generosity has limits and mine had just been reached. The way she phrased it as stepping up like a real partner revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed our relationship. I was supposed to provide resources and accommodation while she determined what qualified as adequate contribution from my end. Her confidence in delivering this ultimatum told me she'd already decided I'd agree, probably discussed it with Vanessa as a done deal, making my refusal all the more shocking to her expectation of control. I looked around my loft, at the equipment I'd worked years to afford, at the space I'd created for both productivity and peace, and realized I wasn't willing to let it become a chaos zone every weekend to subsidize someone else's dream. Rachel's expression shifted when she saw my face, probably recognizing that her calculation had backfired, but by then it was too late to take back the ultimatum that had just changed everything between us. The silence stretched between us as I processed what she'd actually asked of me, and I could see her growing uncomfortable with my lack of immediate agreement, her foot starting that nervous tapping that meant she was realizing this conversation wasn't going according to her plan. "I'll pack my bags then," I said calmly, and watched Rachel's confident expression collapse into shock. She'd clearly expected me to argue, negotiate, or eventually cave to her demands like I had with her smaller requests before, but something about the finality in my voice told her this conversation had just taken an unexpected turn. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she managed to stammer out that she hadn't meant I should actually leave, that we could discuss this reasonably if I'd just stop being so stubborn about helping family. But I was already walking to my bedroom to pull out a suitcase, and the sound of the zipper opening seemed to snap her out of her shock and into panic mode. She followed me, talking rapidly about how I was overreacting and taking things too seriously, but I kept methodically packing my essentials while she watched with growing alarm. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was packing to leave my own apartment, but I had a recording session booked at the downtown studio where I work, and staying there temporarily seemed like the cleanest way to avoid the inevitable drama that would follow my refusal. Rachel's tone shifted from commanding to pleading as she realized I wasn't bluffing, telling me she didn't understand why I was being so dramatic over watching some kids for a few hours, conveniently ignoring the thousands of dollars in damage they'd already caused and the fact that her proposed schedule would consume 36 hours of my weekend time every single week. I finished packing and told her I'd be staying at the studio for the weekend, giving her time to make other arrangements for the childcare situation she'd assumed I'd provide without consulting me first. What I didn't expect was for Vanessa to show up at my workplace on Saturday morning with all 3 children in tow, assuming I'd eventually come around and honor what Rachel had apparently promised on my behalf without any confirmation from me. My coworkers at the recording studio were initially confused when this woman and 3 young children appeared in our lobby, demanding to know where Connor was and insisting that he was supposed to watch the kids while she went to some dance competition in another city. The studio manager, Mike, came to find me in the mixing room where I was working on a client's album, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and concern as he explained that there was a situation in the lobby involving my personal life that was disrupting our professional environment. I had to explain that my girlfriend's sister had somehow gotten the impression that our professional recording facility was an appropriate place for impromptu childcare, despite the fact that we handle expensive equipment and maintain strict protocols about who can access our workspaces. Mike's expression shifted from confusion to alarm when I told him about the equipment damage these same children had caused at my loft, and he immediately called building security to escort them out before they could wander into any of the studios where expensive gear was set up for current projects. The scene in the lobby was spectacular, with Vanessa shouting about family obligations and how I was ruining her chance to compete in some regional ballroom championship that she claimed was crucial for her dance career advancement, while her children ran around touching everything they could reach despite the security guards' attempts to corral them toward the exit. Several of my colleagues witnessed the entire spectacle, including our senior engineer who'd been here for 15 years and had never seen anything like this disruption of our professional atmosphere. By Monday morning, the story had spread through our small professional community with various embellishments about the crazy woman who'd tried to turn a recording studio into a daycare center, and I found myself answering awkward questions about my personal life from people who'd never shown interest in anything beyond my technical skills. I spent the weekend changing all my locks and updating my building's security protocols to prevent any future unauthorized visits from Rachel's family, then systematically packed all of Rachel's belongings into boxes while she launched a social media campaign painting me as an unsupportive partner who'd abandoned her in her time of need. Her Instagram posts about toxic men who couldn't handle real commitment were passive-aggressive masterpieces, carefully worded to generate sympathy without mentioning the specific demands I'd refused or the financial burden she'd been placing on me for nearly a year. The comments from her friends were predictably supportive, full of encouragement to find someone who deserved her and vague threats about what real men should do for their partners, though none of them offered to help with the childcare situation that had started this whole conflict. But the real confrontation came when Rachel returned with reinforcements, her mother and Vanessa, all three of them armed with guilt trips about family loyalty and accusations that I was being selfish over what they characterized as a simple favor between people who cared about each other. They'd clearly coordinated their approach, with Rachel's mother leading the emotional manipulation about how disappointed she was in someone she'd thought was a good man, while Vanessa focused on the practical argument that dance partnerships were rare opportunities that couldn't be wasted and that I was destroying her dreams over what she called a minor inconvenience. Rachel's mother had this way of speaking that made everything sound like a personal failing, telling me how she'd raised her daughters to value family above everything else and how she couldn't understand what kind of man would prioritize his possessions over helping children in need. Vanessa's approach was more direct, explaining in excruciating detail how much money she'd already invested in costumes, lessons, and travel expenses for this dance partnership, making it sound like my refusal to babysit was somehow stealing money directly from her pocket. Rachel herself seemed to have convinced herself that my refusal was just a negotiation tactic, that if they applied enough pressure I'd eventually see reason and agree to the childcare arrangement she'd promised without considering whether I'd actually consent to it. She kept interrupting the other two to add details about how good I'd always been with children, as if previous positive interactions with well-behaved kids at family gatherings had somehow committed me to managing three destructive forces of nature every weekend for the foreseeable future. The conversation became circular, with them refusing to accept that I simply wouldn't agree to spend my weekends babysitting children who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted around my equipment, and me repeating that this wasn't a negotiation but a final decision that wouldn't change regardless of how they framed their arguments. When they realized I wasn't going to budge, the guilt trips escalated into accusations that I was cold, selfish, and clearly not ready for the responsibilities that come with being part of a real family, which struck me as particularly ironic coming from people who wanted to dump their actual family responsibilities on someone else. The irony of being lectured about family responsibilities by people who wanted to dump their childcare duties on someone else wasn't lost on me, but I kept my observations to myself and simply restated my position until they finally left, taking Rachel's boxes with them and slamming my door hard enough to rattle the windows and probably disturb my neighbors who'd already had to witness too much drama from my relationship. Week 2 brought an escalation I hadn't anticipated. An organized harassment campaign involving the entire ballroom dance community that Rachel and Vanessa belonged to. My phone started ringing at all hours with calls from dance instructors, competition organizers, and fellow dancers who'd been fed some twisted version of events that painted me as a villain destroying dreams and abandoning family obligations. These strangers felt entitled to lecture me about commitment and supporting the arts, clearly believing whatever story they'd been told about my refusal to help with childcare that had somehow become my responsibility in their minds. The calls started early Monday morning with someone named Patricia from the Elite Dance Academy, explaining in a condescending tone how important it was for the dance community to support each other and how disappointed she was to hear about my lack of commitment to Vanessa's partnership. I tried to explain that I wasn't part of the dance community and had never agreed to any childcare arrangement, but she cut me off to inform me that real men don't abandon their obligations and that my behavior was affecting the entire competitive dance season schedule. Her lecture continued for 10 minutes, covering everything from the sacrifice required for artistic excellence to the importance of community support in competitive ballroom dancing, as if I'd personally signed a contract to support every dancer in the region. By Tuesday, I was getting calls from competition judges who'd somehow obtained my personal number, telling me how my selfishness was damaging the integrity of their events because partnerships were being disrupted by childcare issues that they seemed to believe were my fault. One particularly aggressive judge named Marcus called me during a client meeting to explain that dance partnerships required community support and that my refusal to help was basically sabotaging months of preparation and training that multiple couples had invested in the upcoming competition season. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd been involved in competitive dancing for decades, explaining the intricate web of relationships and commitments that made the dance community function, and how my betrayal of trust was sending ripples through the entire network. The absurdity of being lectured about dance community values by complete strangers would have been funny if it weren't so invasive and persistent, but these people seemed genuinely convinced that I owed something to the collective success of their artistic endeavors. Wednesday brought calls from other dance parents who'd been told I was the reason their children's competition schedule was being affected, apparently because Vanessa had convinced them that my childcare refusal was causing some kind of domino effect throughout the regional dance circuit that would impact multiple families. These parents seemed to believe that I owed something to their children's dance education, explaining how competitive ballroom required sacrifice from everyone involved and how my selfishness was setting a bad example for the younger dancers who looked up to the adult partnerships. One mother spent 15 minutes detailing the financial sacrifices her family had made for their daughter's dance career, as if my refusal to babysit other people's children was somehow undermining their investment in lessons, costumes, and travel expenses. The most surreal call came from a dance costume designer who lectured me about the financial investment people make in competitive dancing and how my behavior was disrespecting the artistry and dedication that goes into each performance, explaining that when partnerships fail due to logistical issues like childcare, it affects the entire supply chain of costume designers, choreographers, and coaches who depend on successful dance partnerships for their livelihoods. I started documenting these calls, partly for legal reasons and partly because the coordination was so obvious that it felt like evidence of something that might become important later if this harassment escalated to actual threats or interference with my business. By Thursday, Vanessa had escalated to creating a GoFundMe page with my name prominently featured, claiming that I had promised to pay for professional childcare for her children and then abandoned this commitment, leaving her unable to afford the help she needed to continue competing in the dance circuit. The fundraiser description was a masterpiece of manipulation, explaining how a trusted family friend had made financial commitments to support her dance career and then cruelly withdrawn that support without warning, forcing her to choose between her children's well-being and her artistic dreams that she'd worked years to cultivate. The page included photos of her in elaborate dance costumes and videos of her performances, designed to generate sympathy for her plight as a single mother trying to pursue her passion while being betrayed by someone she trusted with her family's future. Within hours, the fundraiser had raised over $800 from sympathetic strangers who believed they were helping a struggling artist overcome the cruelty of an unreliable man who'd promised support and then withdrawn it maliciously. I spent Friday morning on the phone with GoFundMe's fraud department, explaining that I had never made any financial commitments to this woman and that the entire premise of the fundraiser was fabricated to generate sympathy and money based on false claims. The representative was helpful but explained that they needed documentation to prove the claims were false, so I had to provide screenshots of text messages and emails showing that I had explicitly refused the childcare arrangement and never agreed to pay for alternatives, essentially proving a negative while Vanessa collected money from strangers based on her fabricated story. While I was dealing with the GoFundMe situation, Rachel's father decided to join the campaign, and this escalation genuinely concerned me because he was a retired police officer with connections throughout the local law enforcement community who could potentially cause real problems for my career and reputation. He started showing up at my workplace, not causing scenes but making his presence known in ways that felt deliberately intimidating, like he was conducting some kind of unofficial investigation into my character. He'd park across from the studio entrance and sit in his car for hours, occasionally walking through the lobby to ask building security if they knew when I typically arrived or left for the day, creating an atmosphere of surveillance that my colleagues couldn't help but notice. My colleagues noticed this pattern and started asking if I was having legal troubles or if there was some kind of investigation involving me, forcing me to explain that my ex-girlfriend's father was trying to intimidate me into agreeing to babysit his other daughter's children, an explanation that sounded so absurd that I could see doubt in their faces. When the workplace intimidation didn't work, Rachel's father started calling my clients directly, introducing himself as a concerned family member who felt obligated to warn them about my character and reliability in personal commitments, suggesting that someone who would abandon family obligations might not be trustworthy in professional relationships either. He had somehow obtained my client list, probably through Rachel's access to my computer during the months she'd lived in my apartment, and was systematically contacting people I worked with to suggest that my personal behavior might affect my professional performance in ways they should consider when deciding whether to continue working with me. 2 clients called me directly to ask about these concerning phone calls, and I had to make the uncomfortable decision to involve my lawyer in sending cease and desist letters to everyone involved in this harassment campaign, explaining that their coordinated efforts to damage my reputation and interfere with my business relationships constituted harassment and potentially defamation. The legal fees were adding up quickly, but the alternative was letting this coordinated attack on my reputation continue unchecked, potentially damaging the career I'd spent years building in a small professional community where reputation meant everything and word-of-mouth referrals were essential for maintaining steady work. The breaking point came when I realized Rachel had been using my modified Honda Civic for weeks without my explicit permission, and that the car contained thousands of dollars worth of custom sound equipment I'd installed for my mobile recording work. I'd been so focused on the apartment drama that I hadn't thought about the vehicle situation, but when I needed to transport equipment to a client's location and went to retrieve my car from the building's garage, I discovered it was missing. Rachel had been treating it like her personal vehicle ever since she moved in, using it for her freelance design meetings and apparently giving Vanessa access to it as well for dance-related errands without ever asking if this arrangement worked for me. The car itself was worth about $15,000, but the custom audio system I'd installed was worth nearly that much again, featuring specialized recording equipment, professional-grade amplifiers, and acoustic treatment that I'd spent 2 years perfecting for mobile recording sessions with clients who needed on-location sound work. When I called Rachel to ask where my car was, she acted like I was being unreasonable for wanting it back, explaining that Vanessa needed it to transport her dance costumes and equipment to a major competition that weekend and suggesting that I was being petty for prioritizing my transportation needs over her sister's artistic career. The casual assumption that my vehicle and expensive equipment were somehow community property available for their family's use was the final straw in a series of boundary violations that had been escalating for weeks, revealing a level of entitlement that went far beyond the childcare demands I'd already refused. I told Rachel I was coming to retrieve my car immediately, regardless of whatever transportation arrangements Vanessa had made that didn't involve asking my permission first or acknowledging that she was using someone else's property for her personal benefit. Rachel's response was to threaten that if I took the car back, I'd be sabotaging Vanessa's competition and proving that I really didn't care about family obligations, as if my refusal to let them use my property without permission was somehow evidence of my character flaws rather than basic boundary enforcement that any reasonable person would understand. I drove to the dance studio where Vanessa was rehearsing, bringing a locksmith with me because I suspected Rachel might have hidden the spare key to prevent me from reclaiming my own vehicle, a suspicion that proved correct when I found the key missing from its usual location in the apartment. The studio parking lot was crowded with dancers preparing for the regional competition, their cars loaded with elaborate costumes, shoes, and accessories that represented months of preparation and significant financial investment in what was clearly a serious and competitive artistic community. My Honda Civic sat in the middle of this chaos, and I could see through the windows that Vanessa had filled it with her dance supplies, treating my vehicle like her personal storage unit without any consideration for the expensive equipment already installed inside or the fact that I might need access to my own car for my own work. When I approached the car with the locksmith, Vanessa emerged from the studio in full costume and makeup, creating a dramatic scene in front of dozens of other competitors who immediately started filming with their phones, probably thinking they were witnessing some kind of crisis or emergency situation. She began shouting about how I was destroying her dreams and sabotaging months of preparation, making it sound like I was stealing something that belonged to her rather than reclaiming my own property that she'd been using without permission, and appealing to the crowd of dancers as if they could somehow intervene in what was clearly a private property dispute. The other dancers quickly gathered around, creating an audience for what became an impressive performance of victimhood and manipulation, with Vanessa explaining to anyone who would listen how a trusted family friend was abandoning her in her moment of greatest need, conveniently omitting the fact that I had explicitly refused to provide childcare and had never given permission for my vehicle to be used as her personal transportation. The locksmith worked efficiently while this drama unfolded around us, and I watched dozens of phones recording what they probably thought was footage of some cruel ex-boyfriend destroying a struggling artist's dreams, not realizing they were documenting my attempt to reclaim my own property from someone who'd been using it without authorization. The irony wasn't lost on me that these people were documenting my attempt to reclaim my own property as if it were some kind of theft, but I kept my mouth shut and let the locksmith finish his work while Vanessa continued her theatrical performance for the growing crowd of dancers who seemed eager to involve themselves in drama that had nothing to do with them. When I finally got into my car, I discovered that Vanessa had not only filled it with her belongings but had also spilled coffee on my custom audio interface and somehow managed to crack the screen on my portable recording monitor, damage that probably occurred because she had no idea what any of the equipment was or how much it cost to replace. The damage wasn't as catastrophic as what her children had done to my apartment equipment, but it was still hundreds of dollars in repairs that I'd have to handle myself because there was no way to hold her accountable for the careless treatment of equipment she probably didn't even realize was valuable or understand was essential for my professional work. As I drove away from the studio parking lot, I could see the crowd of dancers still filming and discussing what they'd witnessed, probably already uploading videos with captions about toxic men who abandon struggling artists, adding to the social media narrative that Rachel and Vanessa had been building to make themselves look like victims rather than people who'd been taking advantage of someone else's generosity. The whole spectacle had been captured from multiple angles and would likely become part of Rachel and Vanessa's ongoing social media campaign to portray me as the villain in their story, giving them more ammunition for their claim that I was an unsupportive partner who prioritized material possessions over family relationships. That evening, Rachel showed up at my apartment for what she claimed would be our final conversation, but what turned out to be her last desperate attempt at manipulation, featuring every tactic she'd used throughout our relationship to get me to comply with her demands when reason and negotiation failed. She started by claiming she was pregnant, which would have been concerning if we'd had any physical intimacy in the weeks leading up to our breakup, but since we hadn't, I suspected this was another fabrication designed to complicate my decision to end the relationship and create a new obligation that would keep me tethered to her family's drama. I told her I'd be happy to accompany her to a doctor's appointment to confirm the pregnancy, at which point she quickly changed the subject and admitted she might have been mistaken about the symptoms she'd been experiencing, revealing that this was indeed another manipulation attempt that crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. The pregnancy claim was followed by threats about how difficult she could make my life if I didn't reconsider the childcare arrangement, then by promises about how much better our relationship could be if I just showed more family commitment and learned to prioritize the right things in life. Finally, she revealed what I suspected had been her plan all along. She'd already started dating Marcus, a wealthy dance instructor who owned multiple studios in the region and could provide the lifestyle she'd always wanted but had never been able to afford on her freelance income. The revelation explained her sudden confidence in issuing ultimatums and her assumption that I'd eventually cave to her demands, because she'd already secured an upgrade and was just managing the transition in a way that made her look like the victim rather than someone who'd been planning her exit strategy for weeks while still living rent-free in my apartment. A month later, Vanessa cornered me at my favorite coffee shop with a conversation that would completely reframe everything I thought I knew about the situation. She looked exhausted and defeated, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden and had finally decided to put it down. Without any theatrical flair, she asked to sit down and talk, explaining there were things I needed to know about what had really been happening behind the scenes. The revelation was more shocking than anything I could have anticipated. Rachel had been planning to leave me for Marcus, the wealthy dance instructor, for months before the childcare ultimatum ever came up, and the whole family crisis had been orchestrated to make me the villain in the breakup story. Vanessa explained that Rachel had met Marcus at a dance event 6 months earlier and had been strategically cultivating their relationship, positioning herself as an underappreciated woman trapped with an unsupportive partner. The childcare ultimatum wasn't about family obligations. It was designed to be impossible to accept, giving Rachel a reason to leave that made her look like the victim rather than someone who'd been planning her exit strategy for months. But the most shocking revelation was about the money. Rachel had been systematically stealing from me, using her access to my computer and banking information to transfer funds that she claimed were for household expenses but were actually being used to pay for expensive private dance lessons with Marcus. Vanessa showed me screenshots of text conversations where Rachel bragged about how easy it was to manipulate someone who trusted her, detailing specific amounts she'd taken and how she'd covered her tracks by making the transfers look like legitimate shared expenses. The total was staggering, over $3,000 in unauthorized transfers that had been disguised as grocery shopping, utility payments, and other household expenses. Rachel had even used my credit card information to pay for dance costumes and accessories, treating my accounts like her personal shopping fund while complaining that I wasn't financially supportive enough. The children's destructive behavior during their visit hadn't been accidental either, according to Vanessa, who admitted that she'd encouraged them to be as disruptive as possible, hoping to create enough chaos that I'd either become completely submissive to their demands or reach my breaking point and leave. The plan was designed to work either way. If I submitted completely, Rachel would have had a perfect arrangement where I funded her dance pursuits while providing free babysitting, and if I refused, she'd have a dramatic story about an unsupportive partner that justified her relationship with Marcus. The most devastating part of Vanessa's confession was learning that she'd lost custody of her children to their father the week before, not because of dance-related neglect, but because the family court had discovered the elaborate fraud scheme and determined that she was an unfit parent who was willing to involve her children in complex manipulation and theft operations. The judge had been particularly disturbed by evidence that the children had been coached to destroy property and create chaos as part of their mother's schemes, determining that this level of manipulation constituted emotional abuse that warranted immediate removal from her care. Her dance partnership had also collapsed when her partner discovered the extent of the lies and manipulation, deciding he couldn't trust someone willing to defraud strangers and involve children in criminal activity for competitive dancing funding. In a strange twist, I found an unexpected ally in Rachel's younger brother Kevin, a college student who had witnessed enough of his family's manipulation tactics to recognize what was happening and felt compelled to reach out. Kevin had provided Vanessa with some of the evidence she was sharing, including screenshots of family group chat conversations where Rachel bragged about her successful theft from my accounts and detailed her plans for transitioning from my financial support to Marcus's more substantial wealth. I encountered Rachel at the Regional Ballroom Dance Championship 2 months later, not because I sought her out, but because I was working the event as the sound engineer for the venue. I'd taken the contract months earlier, before any of this drama started, and it had become a significant source of income that I couldn't afford to walk away from despite the personal complications. The irony of providing audio support for the very dance community that had harassed me wasn't lost on me, but I approached it as just another professional job and focused on delivering the quality sound production that would ensure future bookings in the entertainment industry. I was setting up the main soundboard when I spotted Rachel across the competition floor, dressed in an elaborate emerald green gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, practicing her routine with Marcus in preparation for their evening performance. They moved together with synchronized precision that only comes from extensive training and significant financial investment, and I had to admit they looked like serious competitors who belonged in this elevated tier of ballroom dancing. Watching them rehearse, I felt absolutely nothing beyond mild professional curiosity about whether their partnership would hold up under the pressure of live competition, and I realized that whatever emotional attachment I'd once had to Rachel had completely evaporated during the months of manipulation and harassment that followed our breakup. The transformation was remarkable. She'd gone from the struggling freelance graphic designer who couldn't afford her own rent to someone who clearly had access to the kind of resources that competitive ballroom dancing at this level required, confirming what Vanessa had told me about Marcus's wealth and Rachel's strategic positioning to access it. During the afternoon practice sessions, I watched from my position at the sound booth as drama unfolded that had nothing to do with me but everything to do with Rachel's character and the pattern of manipulation she'd used throughout our relationship. There were heated discussions between Rachel and Marcus that escalated into public arguments about money, with Rachel demanding additional funding for private coaching sessions and Marcus questioning where the money he'd already provided had gone, creating exactly the kind of scene that competitive dancers typically avoid in front of judges and other couples. The arguments revealed that Rachel's transition to her new lifestyle hadn't been as smooth as she'd probably anticipated, and that Marcus was beginning to discover the financial reality of supporting someone whose spending habits far exceeded their actual needs or reasonable expectations for competitive dancing expenses. I could hear fragments of their conversation through the sound system during sound checks, with Rachel insisting that she needed additional private lessons with a specialist coach who charged $500 per session, while Marcus pointed out that she'd already spent thousands on coaching that hadn't significantly improved their competition results. The tension between them was affecting other couples in the practice area, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere that the competition organizers were clearly trying to manage without causing a public scene that would reflect poorly on their event. By evening, when the main competition began, the tension between Rachel and Marcus was visible even from my position behind the soundboard, affecting their performance in ways that were obvious to anyone familiar with competitive ballroom dancing standards. Their routine, which had looked polished during practice, fell apart during the actual competition, with timing issues and missed steps that suggested their personal conflict was interfering with their ability to function as a dance partnership under pressure. I watched judges subtract points for technical errors that could have been avoided if they'd maintained the focus and coordination that successful competitive dancing requires, and I realized I was witnessing the beginning of the end of Rachel's carefully constructed upgrade to a more luxurious lifestyle. The mistakes weren't just minor stumbles, they were fundamental breakdowns in partnership trust and communication that competitive dancing demands, revealing that their personal relationship had deteriorated to the point where they couldn't maintain the synchronized timing and spatial awareness that high-level ballroom requires. The real spectacle came during the awards ceremony, when Rachel and Marcus were not among the winning couples and Rachel's reaction to losing became a public scene that effectively ended their partnership on the spot. She began arguing loudly with Marcus about his coaching methods and preparation strategies, blaming him for their poor performance while completely ignoring her own contributions to the technical failures that had cost them points with the judges. Marcus, clearly embarrassed by the public display and probably fed up with months of Rachel's financial demands and entitled behavior, announced in front of dozens of other competitors that he was terminating their partnership immediately and would no longer be providing funding for her competitive dancing pursuits. The announcement was delivered with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation or reconciliation, and I could see other dancers pulling out their phones to record what was clearly going to become gossip material for the competitive dancing community for months to come. The breakup was swift and brutal, with Rachel standing alone on the competition floor in her expensive gown while Marcus walked away with their trophies from previous competitions, leaving her to face the reality that her latest relationship had crumbled in exactly the same pattern as her previous ones once the financial demands became unsustainable. I watched this unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a predictable outcome, realizing that Rachel's pattern of finding generous partners and then testing their limits until they reached their breaking point was not something she'd learned from our relationship, but rather a strategy she'd been using for years and would probably continue using until she exhausted her options. The scene reminded me of our own breakup, except this time Rachel was the one being abandoned in front of an audience, experiencing the kind of public humiliation that she tried to inflict on me through her social media campaigns and harassment efforts. After the ceremony, word spread quickly through the dance community about Rachel's public meltdown and the circumstances surrounding her partnership with Marcus, creating exactly the kind of reputation damage that competitive dancers work carefully to avoid. Multiple people approached me during the equipment breakdown to apologize for their participation in the harassment campaign months earlier, explaining that they now understood they'd been manipulated into attacking someone who had never been part of their community and had never made the commitments Rachel claimed I'd abandoned. The apologies were awkward but sincere, and I appreciated that these people had taken the time to acknowledge their mistake and recognize that they'd been used as unwitting participants in Rachel's manipulation scheme. Several instructors and competition organizers also approached me to compliment the sound quality throughout the event and to ask about my availability for future competitions, confirming that my professional reputation had survived the personal attacks and that I could continue building my audio production business without the baggage of Rachel's family drama affecting my career prospects. As I packed up my equipment that night, I reflected on how completely I'd moved on from the drama that had consumed weeks of my life just a few months earlier. Seeing Rachel's public humiliation should have felt satisfying, given the harassment and manipulation I'd endured, but instead I felt only mild pity for someone who seemed incapable of learning from her mistakes or building genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. The venue manager approached me as I finished loading my truck, complimenting the sound quality throughout the event and asking about my availability for their annual gala in the spring, which confirmed that my professional reputation had survived the personal attacks and that I could continue building my career without interference from Rachel's ongoing drama. The evening had been a perfect demonstration of how things work out when you maintain your integrity and refuse to be drawn into other people's toxic behavior patterns, and I drove home feeling grateful that I'd had the strength to walk away from that situation when I did rather than allowing myself to be manipulated into enabling Rachel's destructive lifestyle choices. 6 weeks after the dance competition, I found myself reflecting on how the entire experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of relationships, boundaries, and the importance of recognizing manipulation before it takes root in your life. The ultimatum that had seemed like such a crisis at the time had actually been a gift, forcing me to confront patterns I'd been unconsciously enabling and revealing the true nature of people I'd mistakenly trusted with my time, energy, and resources. What I'd initially seen as Rachel's desperate attempt to involve me in her family's childcare needs had actually been the final test in a systematic evaluation of how much exploitation I would tolerate before finally pushing back and reclaiming my autonomy. The entire situation had revealed not just Rachel's manipulative nature, but an entire family system built on the assumption that generous, accommodating people existed primarily to subsidize other people's choices and absorb the consequences of their poor planning and entitled expectations. I realized that Rachel's pattern of escalating demands hadn't been random or impulsive, but rather a calculated process of testing boundaries and conditioning me to accept increasingly unreasonable requests by framing my compliance as evidence of love and my resistance as proof of selfishness. The childcare ultimatum had been designed to be the ultimate test. Either I would submit completely to their family's demands and become a permanent resource for them to exploit, or I would refuse and provide Rachel with the victim narrative she needed to justify her transition to Marcus while portraying herself as someone who'd been abandoned by an unsupportive partner rather than someone who'd been systematically taking advantage of someone's generosity for months. The beauty of the situation, in retrospect, was that my simple refusal to engage with their manipulation had exposed the entire scheme and forced them to reveal their true motivations without any dramatic confrontations or lengthy explanations on my part. By treating Rachel's ultimatum as exactly what it was, a choice between staying in a toxic relationship or leaving, I'd avoided getting drawn into the kind of circular arguments and emotional manipulation that would have prolonged the drama while achieving the same inevitable outcome. The months that followed had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of early boundary setting and the danger of making small compromises with people who view generosity as weakness rather than kindness. I'd learned to recognize the difference between someone who occasionally needs help and someone who systematically seeks out generous people to exploit, and I developed a much clearer understanding of what healthy reciprocity looks like in both personal and professional relationships. The warning signs I'd missed with Rachel were now obvious to me. The gradual escalation of requests, the emotional manipulation when I hesitated to comply, the way she framed my resources as somehow belonging to her family, and most importantly, the complete absence of gratitude or reciprocal consideration for my needs and boundaries. I'd also learned to pay attention to how people talked about their previous relationships and family dynamics, recognizing that someone who consistently portrayed themselves as a victim of other people's selfishness was probably someone who had unrealistic expectations about what others owed them. My newfound peace included rediscovering my passion for music production in ways I'd neglected while my time and energy were being consumed by Rachel's constant needs and demands. Without the distraction of managing her emotional crises and financial emergencies, I'd been able to focus on expanding my audio production business and developing the kind of professional relationships that were based on mutual respect and clear expectations rather than manipulation and exploitation. I'd invested in new equipment and studio improvements that would have been impossible while supporting Rachel's lifestyle, and the quality of my work had improved significantly now that I could dedicate full attention to my craft instead of being constantly interrupted by her family's manufactured emergencies. I'd started volunteering at a community music program for underprivileged youth, teaching basic recording techniques and sound engineering to teenagers who were genuinely excited about learning and grateful for the opportunity to work with professional equipment. The contrast between these young people's appreciation for what I was offering and Rachel's entitled expectation that I owe her unlimited access to my resources was striking and reminded me of what healthy relationships should feel like. Working with these kids had also given me perspective on what real family obligations look like versus the artificial emergencies that Rachel and Vanessa had created to justify their demands on my time and money. These teenagers often had genuine responsibilities caring for younger siblings or helping support their families financially, but they approached these challenges with maturity and problem-solving rather than expecting strangers to absorb the burden of their circumstances. They understood the difference between asking for help and demanding that someone else take responsibility for their problems, and they showed genuine appreciation when adults invested time in teaching them skills that could improve their future prospects. The volunteer work had put me in contact with other professionals who shared similar values about giving back to the community on our own terms rather than being voluntold into obligations by people who saw our skills and resources as something they were entitled to access without reciprocal contribution. Through this network, I'd met several people who'd had similar experiences with manipulative partners or family members, and hearing their stories had confirmed that Rachel's behavior pattern was unfortunately common among people who prioritize their wants over other people's boundaries. These conversations had been therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected, helping me understand that the situation I'd experienced wasn't unique or particularly personal, but rather a predictable outcome when generous people encounter individuals who've learned to exploit others' kindness without offering anything meaningful in return. The most valuable insight I'd gained from the entire experience was understanding that ultimatums are actually gifts that reveal people's true characters and motivations, allowing you to make informed decisions about relationships before investing more time and energy in people who don't share your values or respect your autonomy. When someone presents you with a choice between meeting their demands or losing their presence in your life, they're essentially telling you that your value to them is conditional on your willingness to be exploited, and the appropriate response is gratitude for the clarity rather than negotiation about the terms. This realization had transformed how I approached all relationships, both personal and professional, giving me the confidence to set clear boundaries from the beginning and to view attempts at manipulation as useful information about people's character rather than challenges to be overcome through accommodation or compromise. I'd also learned to appreciate the difference between people who contribute to your life and people who simply consume resources while creating drama and complications that distract from your actual goals and priorities. The peace I felt in my daily life without Rachel's constant needs and manufactured crises had shown me how much energy I'd been spending on managing someone else's poor choices instead of focusing on building the kind of life I actually wanted to live. My sleep had improved dramatically without the stress of wondering what new emergency or demand would interrupt my weekend plans, and my productivity had increased significantly now that my schedule was determined by my own priorities rather than other people's last-minute crises. My professional success had accelerated significantly once I stopped spending weekends dealing with Rachel's family emergencies and started dedicating that time to networking, skill development, and building client relationships that would support my long-term career goals. The audio production business had grown to the point where I was considering hiring an assistant and expanding into larger entertainment industry contracts that would have been impossible to pursue while my schedule was being dictated by other people's last-minute demands and artificial crises. I'd been able to take on projects that required travel and flexible scheduling because I no longer had to worry about someone else's children destroying my equipment while I was away or returning home to find that my vehicle had been appropriated for someone else's hobby-related transportation needs. The financial benefits of not supporting Rachel's lifestyle had been equally significant, allowing me to pay off my loft mortgage early and start building the kind of savings that would enable me to take risks and pursue opportunities that required financial stability rather than living paycheck to paycheck while someone else spent my money on their hobbies and wants. I'd calculated that Rachel's presence in my life had been costing me nearly $1,200 per month in direct expenses and lost opportunities, money that was now funding improvements to my studio, professional development, and long-term financial security that would benefit my future in measurable ways. Looking back, I could see that the entire experience had been a necessary education in recognizing and responding to manipulation, boundary violations, and the kind of entitled behavior that destroys relationships and exploits generous people who haven't learned to distinguish between legitimate requests for help and systematic attempts to transfer responsibility for someone's poor choices onto others. The story had become a reminder that sometimes the best response to step up or get out is simply getting out and discovering how much better life can be without people who see your kindness as an invitation to take advantage rather than an opportunity to build something meaningful together. Most importantly, I'd learned that maintaining your integrity and refusing to enable toxic behavior doesn't make you selfish or unsupportive. It makes you someone who understands the difference between healthy relationships based on mutual respect and exploitative arrangements disguised as love or family obligation, and that distinction is essential for building a life that reflects your values rather than other people's demands.